Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today from across the world. Let's give everyone 2 minutes to join and then we can get started. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome again. We are just waiting for a few more people to stream in. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This is an ongoing series, Our Warming Planet, Climate Change Impacts and Adaptation webinar series, which we started in February this year. And this is our 10th bi-weekly webinar since the book launch. And today's lecture is by Guy Midgley on climate change risks in biodiversity hotspots. And he will focus on a case study of South Africa. Guy is from the University of Stellenbosch in South Africa. And this is very exciting for me because I first came across Guy's work in 2005 when I was doing my master's in biodiversity conservation. And I have this book here, which I think Guy might recognize. This has a really great chapter from Guy, but I read multiple books from him. It was a very exciting topic. This was 17 years ago, so not many people talked about climate change and biodiversity, and Guy was one of the first. So this is especially exciting for me as well, and I'm sure we all have a very interesting hour ahead of us. So let me begin by just going over the agenda. So we have myself and David doing this introduction. We will also do a poll to get to know the audience. Then we have Guy's lecture on climate risks in biodiversity hotspots, a case study of South Africa. Then Jen Evans will moderate a live Q&A session. So we encourage you to start asking questions in the Q&A box. And then we'll do a brief wrap up. So today's webinar is about an hour. Over to the next. I would also like to introduce the editors of this book, Our Warming Planet. This is the second in the series, and it's focused on climate change impacts and adaptation. This book is in honor of Martin Parry, who is a pioneer on climate impacts and played a key role in the 2007 IPCC report. Martin is a visiting professor at the Center for Environmental Policy at Imperial College London. He was co-chair of IPCC Working Group 2 and a convening lead author of 3 IPC assessments. He has been a professor of geography at the University of Oxford, University College London, East Anglia and Birmingham in the UK. We have Cynthia Rosenzweig, who is editor of this book, but also a series editor. And she is a senior research scientist at Columbia University's Center for Climate Systems Research and at the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies, where she heads the Climate Impacts Group. She's the co-founder of the Agricultural Model Intercomparison and Improvement Project, AGMIP, and she was also a coordinating lead author of several IPC assessments. Cynthia was named one of Nature's 10 People Who Mattered in 2012. She's been a recipient of the Guggenheim Fellowship, and in May 2022, so just a couple of months ago, Cynthia was awarded the prestigious World Food Prize. And over to the next slide, Jen. It also gives me great pleasure to introduce David Bryant. He's the series editor of Our Warming Planet, the series, and he will talk a little bit about the book series. David is a senior NASA research emeritus at NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies. For more than 30 years, he was a climate research scientist for NASA, as well as an adjunct professor at Columbia University, teaching graduate level courses in climate dynamics and atmospheric dynamics. He has more than 300 publications relating to climate change, and is a fellow of the American Geophysical Union. He's a recipient of many awards, including being a co-recipient of the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize as a lead author of the IPCC assessment that year. So we would also like to get, so you heard a little bit about the editors, but we would also like to get to know all of you who have joined us in a minute. But before that, I would like to switch over to David, who will talk a little bit about the Our Warming Planet series and also what's in this current edition. Over to you, David.
Thanks. Jen, could you go back to the previous slide for a moment? Well, maybe one previous to that. There we go. So you see the 3 books in the series. So for, 2 of them are out so far. Our Warming Planet Topics in Climate Dynamics came out several years ago. The book being represented here is obviously Our Warming Planet, Climate Change Impacts and Adaptation. And next October, the 3rd book, Studies of Clouds, Convection and Precipitation Processes. The idea behind these books is to provide for teachers, educators in general, or just the general public, information about the leading topics associated with our warming planet. The books are unique in the sense that not only do they have a write-up about the topic, but they also include approximately 20 PowerPoint slides that people can then use for any sort of presentation that they want. These slides are available in the book or online for downloading. So the idea behind this was to allow people all over the world to actually inform themselves and inform others of leading topics, first in climate dynamics, then in climate impacts and adaptation, and coming up, clouds, convection, and precipitation. So it's a pretty unique series. Back to you, Manishka.
Thank you. And these are the topics and authors. A lot of these have been completed. A lot of these lectures have been completed. We are about 2/3 of the way through, and we will also let you know where you can find these recordings. And to the next slide. Great. And I think you can, so here we would like to get to know the audience. So I'll be running a poll with 3 questions. And we would like as many of you to participate in this as possible. So let me just launch it. So the first question is, we really like to know where you're joining us from. And in the past, we've had, there was one time we actually had participants from each region, but Oceania is a little bit harder because it's very late in that region. But typically we have pretty good representation. So we have, I'm going to leave this on for a few more seconds, and we have over 80% of the audience participating. So thanks for that. So I'm going to share the results. So we have Asia, Europe, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and North America participating. Guy, we need to work with you to figure out how we can spread the word in Africa. We've had some participants in the past, but not so much lately. So we'll work on that. And then the next question is to get to know which sector you work in. So we've had a lot of educators, students participating, but once again, we've had pretty good representation from a lot of sectors. So once again, we'll just give it a few more seconds until about 80% of the participants vote in this, and then we can, just waiting for a few more. So keep polling, and we can get a better sense of the representation of sectors. Just a couple of seconds more, so get your answers in. Okay, great. So we've got almost 80% participating, so I'm going to end the poll. Once again, you know, pretty good representation from all sectors, really. So this is great. I'm going to stop sharing and then just going on to the last question. We would like to know your involvement in climate change work. Once again, we've had, you know, people who have various levels of involvement in climate change, including people who want to learn more, people who want to educate people about climate change. So it's really great to have everyone, all of you participating. And once again, just a reminder that these recordings are available. So we will share that link shortly. So let me just give everyone a couple of seconds. We have about 80% of the audience participating. So thank you. I'm going to end the poll. And once again, as you can see, we have good representation from you know, people involved in various aspects of climate change work. So great to have all of you. And we would also like to, you know, as we begin, please start introducing yourselves in the chat as well. You can share as much information as you'd like. So feel free to include your name, country, institution, email, how you think this book might help you. And I will paste that information in the chat so that you can start introducing yourselves. And so we have a guy who sent a message about his power connection. So Guy, just let us know whether you're reconnected, and if so, we can get started. If not, we can wait a few minutes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Guy.
Oh, okay, great.
Great, fantastic.
We just had the pod went completely off for about 2 minutes.
Okay.
And I thought I was being cut off completely, but
yes.
Okay.
No, this is great. We still have you, so that's fantastic. Jen, if you can skip over to the next slide, and then David, over to you to introduce Guy. Thank you.
Dr. Guy Midgley is professor of plant ecology and heads the Global Change Biology Group at Stellenbosch University. He's worked as an ecologist since the 1980s, specializing in stress ecology and climate change impacts on plant species and ecosystems and their adaptive responses. He's authored more than 150 publications addressing a wide variety of ecosystems and environmental drivers. He's a globally highly cited researcher, identified as such by Thomson Reuters in 2014. He's one of 4 South African scientists listed on the Reuters hot list of the top 1,000 most influential climate change scientists in the world. He was a coordinating lead author for the IPCC 4th, 5th, and 6th assessment reports, and for the global report of the Intergovernmental Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. He chaired South Africa's Global Change Science Committee for more than a decade, among many senior national roles. And as you can see, his talk today is entitled Climate Risks and Biodiversity Hotspots, a case study of South Africa. Guy, thanks for coming. Over to you.
My great pleasure. And I'm glad I'm still fully on board. Will you just excuse me as I arrange my screen?
Oh, yes. Take your time, Guy.
Great, and you can, oh, that's fantastic. Oh, this is going to work well. All right. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. Thanks, Manishka, also for your comments about that the work in the 2000s. That was a very productive era. But I have to say that seeing Martin Parry's photograph with that moustache, it gave me a slight feeling of post-traumatic stress disorder. because Andreas Fischlin and I were coordinating lead authors of the ecosystem chapter in 2006. And we were late in submitting, and Martin was quite insistent, but he was a brilliant chair, and he got that report through a plenary in Belgium, and I'll never forget how much effort that took. It was an extraordinary effort, and it was a brilliant report. So. Yeah, I think that's got to rank as one of his biggest achievements. I certainly felt this was massive. But yeah, but thanks for inviting me. I really enjoyed putting together the chapter and this talk. There has been an awful lot of progress since the work that we did in those earlier years, and I'll try and give you an insight into some of the new findings that are coming through, which are extremely interesting, and I think highly germane to an understanding of exactly why it is that we're so worried about biodiversity in a changing climate. Because, we keep hearing from, possibly the more denialist, or what we say, obstructionist fraternity, that climate's always changed. So why should we worry? We can just adapt. Natural ecosystems can adapt. They've been exposed to all sorts of climate change in the past. I think these biodiversity hotspots provide a very interesting insight into why that is an incredibly short-sighted point of view. But what you see in front of you here in my opening slide is a landscape photograph taken in the Cape Fold Belt Mountains of the Southern Cape of South Africa. Manishka, you visited here, you would have wandered a bit in these landscapes, I would imagine. They're spectacular. You've got to go a little bit closer to really appreciate the biodiversity. But the vegetation you see in front of you is called fynbos. It's so named because of the generally small-leaved nature of many shrub species that are found here, like the pale-leaved erica that you see in the foreground, and those pink-leaved everlastings. And then you'll also see some broad-leafed evergreen protea shrubs, and those spindly evergreen restio species as well. It's an extremely rich vegetation type, and like California, it is fire prone, for those of you who are North American. It's extraordinary, but this vegetation type makes up one of only 7 plant kingdoms defined on the planet in a tiny little corner of the world. And its comparisons are odious, but there are more plant species on Table Mountain than there are in the entire British Isles flora, and more species on the Cape Peninsula south of Cape Town than the entire European flora. 8,000 or 9,000 species. It's a phenomenal.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yes.
Guys, sorry to interrupt you. Could you share your screen so we can see the photo of your first
has it disappeared again? Oh, I'm so sorry.
Yeah, that's all right.
That probably happened when the power went off.
Yes, exactly. We saw it earlier. So yeah, great.
Are you back?
Yes. Yes.
Oh no,
perfect.
You've missed the whole thing.
That's okay. You can, give a quick. I was wondering.
Now you can see what I'm talking about. So there's that gorgeous landscape in the Cape Fold Mountains. These are sandstone, often sandstone-derived soils. You can see the granite and sandstone outcrops in the background, and this sandy soil, very, very nutrient poor, but packed full of plant species. This is not too far away from Cape Town. Regions like this really present a challenge to conservation and to adaptation in the biodiversity space, because for many reasons. But how do you go about trying to preserve and conserve and protect thousands of species, many narrow-range endemics, in a changing climate? And answering that question has opened up so many windows into even understanding where all the diversity comes from and the role of climate in the evolution of all this diversity. So this is a phenomenal natural laboratory in which to study how biodiversity has and will respond to climate change and how we might start to work out how to provide assistance through conservation strategies to conserve these species. So yeah, let's see if I can get some forward movement. Let me know this. Yeah, I hope that that's moved forward and you haven't lost the screen again. Is that right?
No, we can see it. Thank you.
Beautiful. Well, the fynbos is a special case and a rare bird, but it does help to make a general point about the vulnerability of rare and endemic species under climate change. And it's important to point out that the climate of this region itself is very special. Mediterranean climates, summer wet and, summer dry and winter wet climates are the rarest officially defined climate type on our planet. And they occupy those areas outlined in red on the globe there. And you'll see that they are in the subtropics, under the influence of this descending arm of the Hadley cell. They tend to be found on sort of western coastlines of continents. Of course, in Southern Africa and Australia, sort of southwest and southern. And they give rise to broadly similar vegetation types, structurally, shrublands, fire-prone, fire-driven, and sclerophyll, quite hard-leafed evergreen type of vegetation. And they have similar soil, they're not all similar in soil type, but it's particularly the very low nutrient systems of the Cape and the Kwongan in Western Australia that have proliferated massively in diversity. So that's the climate situation. And there's something special about these climates. There's also something very vulnerable about these climates as we go into the future, as I will point out. What is special about the rainfall pattern is that these zones are in the area of where the westerly systems sweeping across from South America bring rain-bearing clouds, frontal systems into Southern Africa. And interestingly, because of the annual movement of the intertropical convergence zone, these systems get pushed south of the land mass during summer because of the intensification of the high pressure. And then during winter, they migrate further north. And that's what gives rise to this very predictable winter rainfall regime that sweeps across South Africa, and particularly the Cape. We've always thought it's very, very reliable until Cape Town nearly ran out of water 4 years ago. So it's not perfectly reliable, but it's relatively reliable. But as we'll see, it may become less reliable into the future. But this is clearly an incredibly important determinant of the vegetation that we have here, because it's a very challenging environment for plants in which to grow. Your rain falls during the cold winters and it's dry during the hot summers. So plant growth is very limited in opportunity unless you're deep rooted and can tap into deep water to grow during summer. Otherwise, you've got very short window periods on either side of winter to get your growth done. So it's pretty interesting. But what it does do is it eliminates from this vegetation type one of the most aggressive modern types of plants, C4 grasses. And C4 grasses are really quite a destructive force in a way, because they produce a lot of fuel for wildfires very quickly. And that, because of the winter rainfall and the cold growing season, C4 grasses are excluded from systems like this. So these are one of the very few systems on the planet that have escaped the ravages of C4 grass competition and disturbance-driven effects of having C4 grasses as neighbors. I'm happy to answer more questions about that. I think it's quite a fascinating area. And of course, as climate warms, C4 grasses are going to have more opportunities. Sorry, somebody's just leaving the office. It's evening here. Okay, now, what do we know about the history of the winter rainfall zone? Well, we know that for much of the world, the Pleistocene era, Pleistocene epoch, has generally been colder and drier than is currently the case. If you go back and look at the ice core record, you'll see that CO2 levels drop extremely low during glacial times, as low as 200 parts per million, 180 parts per million. That is limiting to plant growth, extremely limiting to plant growth. In fact, trees would really struggle to maintain their growth under such low CO2 levels. And we've done work on that and shown that this is indeed the case. But while most of the world became drier during glacial times, it looks as though these winter rainfall zones actually became wetter. So that is an extremely interesting finding. So despite the fact that you're getting much colder and more challenging conditions during glacials for much of the world, for the Mediterranean zones, it looks as though they might have been less badly affected by increasing drought, particularly in the Western Cape and South and Chile, where we've got information that supports this. So I'm going to show you some work that's been done to support this. But I do want to point out that we're currently in the Holocene, which is a very short intermission, warm intermission, matched somewhat by the Eemian and other short interglacials. But generally, our planet is a cool, adapted planet for the last 2 million years. The modern flora and fauna of the world is generally adapted to a planet that's about 5 degrees cooler than the pre-industrial. And these interglacials are really short, 10,000, 5,000, 10,000 years worth of time, which were naturally warmer than that background climate. And we are imposing a warming trend on top of this elevated temperature. That's an incredibly important thing to take on board, to understand why we're concerned about biodiversity. Because the planet's modern biota have adapted to much cooler conditions for millions of years. And so people who say climate has always changed, ask them exactly how and why, and see if you can pin them down. They generally don't know. So it's a throwaway. What have we discovered on the west coast of South Africa? Well, this is work done by a brilliant scientist called Jan Berend Stoet in the early 2000s, analyzing seabed cores off the west coast of Southern Africa. And these seabed cores reveal a lot about what happened to the activity of rivers flowing into the western, off the western part of Southern Africa into the Atlantic. And by analyzing these cores, you can detect whether the rivers are switching on or whether they've switched off, because you can work out if there's a lot of mud accumulating on the seabed or whether there's a lot of dust accumulating on the seabed, which would be windblown. And so Jan Berend Stoet put together a 100,000-year record or so of these seabed cores alongside pollen and other analyses, including temperature proxies, which closely match the ice core record. And he was able to show that during glacial times, this westerly zone here, which is indicated by the dotted line, well, that's the polar front and the edge of the ice. That moves further north and it pushes the frontal systems to the north towards the equator. And this particular paper that I'm citing here shows very clearly that there are signals in the trade wind intensity and there are signals in the winter rainfall intensity, which show an increased winter rainfall. This is now the present, going back to 50,000 years ago. There's your glacial time, and you can see that the winter rain intensity has increased very, very substantially from where we are now. So it was much wetter. And this is all those rivers switching on and pumping mud into the ocean. You can see the indicators of the sea ice extent going further north and pushing these frontal systems. It's part of the climate system helping to push the fronts further north. So this kind of process would have been happening over and over during glacial and interglacial cycles over the Pleistocene. And this northward and southward shifting of the winter rainfall belts would have been extremely important for the evolution of the biota in Southern Africa. And we've proposed actually that this has two effects. Number one, by preventing a very dry period of time evolving, it possibly lowers extinction rates, but also by moving species around, but not too far, it might act as a species pump, and that would generate speciation. So fascinating part of the world. And is this one of the things behind the high levels of biodiversity and endemism in this region? I'm going to probably have to speed up a little bit, but Manishka, I hope you'll indulge me. It's kind of a hobby horse. So I've got to contain myself. So I'm showing you now a slide of the work of Brian Enquist at Arizona State. And he's done a global analysis based on the Global Biodiversity Information System of Margalef rarity, which is an index of plant rarity endemism. And these, you can see if you look around the world, the areas of particularly high endemism, and there's a very strong concentration of endemics here in the southwestern part of South Africa. I mean, this is a desert. This part of Southern Africa, it's south of the Namib Desert, and then the Fynbos and the Cape here, very, very high in richness. And one of the things that Brian found was that climate stability between the glacial and interglacial times seems to be one of the explanatory factors behind this particular pattern of richness. So that means that biodiversity may well depend on climate stability. So how does that work? Well, a couple of ways, and this is where you need a bit of ecology and natural science. It's just fascinating. But in the Western Cape, we see the signals of long-term climate stability in different ways. For example, we see that the flora has retained extraordinary species like this Witsinia maura, which is a monospecific genus in the Iridaceae. It's some kind of a relictual species. It's found on marshlands, and for a species to persist as a monospecific genus on a marshland must mean that those marshlands have persisted for millennia. It's not very dispersed very far. It's got a really unique flower structure, this petalless flower structure. It's just a gorgeous thing. It's found in Cape Point. For any of you who visit Cape Town and want to go and see it, you can go down to Cape Point and spot this species. It's a treat to see. It's only found in about 3 or 4 spots throughout the region, very small clumps. And then we see also the evolution of highly evolved interspecies interactions, like this long proboscis fly, which has tied in its lifestyle with the reproduction of the long-tubed iris, Laparizia anceps. So the length of the fly's proboscis is very finely tuned to the depth of the flower, and those sorts of things don't happen overnight. They take thousands to hundreds of thousands of years to evolve, which means they wouldn't evolve under an unstable climate. And that is also evidence of a very long-term stable climate. Another clear piece of evidence is the evolution of very short-range dispersal of plants in the system. So we have in the Fynbos the evolution of ant-dispersed seeds, where the plants hedge their bets on getting picked up by ants and buried, so that they're very safely stashed away. And they do this by producing a body on the seed, which is attractive to ants, called an elysome. And then the ants take the seeds, they eat the elysome, and the seed remains under the ground, safely stashed away until the next fire. And but of course, it's very effective under a stable climate, but under changing climate, this is a death sentence. because you need to migrate, you need to move large distances to track climate change. So you start to see how we think that stable climates have allowed this to evolve, but it sets the system up to be very, very vulnerable. What evidence do we have of recent diversification? Said we think there might be a species pump going on here. This is one piece of evidence in a very speciose group called the Azoaceae. These are ice plants, endemic, not, I would say, near endemic to Southern Africa. There are a few species in Australia and possibly one in the Mediterranean, I'm not sure. But they are in the Mediterranean, I'm not sure if they're endemic. But what we see here is, if you look at the phylogeny of the ice plants, this is a phylogeny with the timing of the evolution of different branches of this group. And we can see here that each one of these little arms at the end here is a species. And the software ties together species that are closely related and when they were likely to have split apart. And what the analysis shows is that the modern flora of ice plants has all evolved in the last, maybe certainly less than 10 million years, maybe as little as 3 to 4 million years. So during the Ice Age. So this is these are species of the Pleistocene and cold adapted, as I said. Why they're so vulnerable? This is where things start to get a little bit frightening. Because if we look at the projections for climate in this biodiversity hotspot region and in other biodiversity hotspots like it, we see that one of the most common and confident projections is for a drying of winter rainfall in these areas, because the strengthening of the Hadley cell pushes the frontal systems towards the poles. And so we see these brown colors here in the rainfall, the delta rainfall plot for different levels of global warming, and up to 40% drier in the Southern Cape if global warming happens at 4 degrees, to a level of 4 degrees. This is why these hotspots are so extremely vulnerable. They appear to have evolved under stable climates, and we are literally pulling the rug out from under their feet at the speed of light. And that is an extremely worrying thing. One thing that we may be driving through warming the summer is, and drying the vegetation, is driving a faster fire cycle, which can accelerate and eliminate species that require many years to develop enough seed storage to be able to survive. These proteas need to grow for several years before they can build up enough seed in the canopy. They use fire to stimulate their seed germination, but it can't be too soon. And if fire burns too frequently, they become extinguished. So this is a real problem for these regions. Now, let's look a bit more broadly at predictions of what is going to happen to biodiversity around the world. And I put up here a very influential and excellent paper by Mark Urban, published in 2015 in Science, which analyzed several or more than 100 studies of projections of the loss of a fauna or floral component under different levels of warming, expressed by a delta above pre-industrial temperature. And what this graph shows here is it's a Bayesian model that fits this curve of trying to estimate a global extinction pattern for in relation to different levels of warming. And he's put in different RCP, resident concentration pathways, and different kind of policy lines here, which indicate what they would result in terms of global biodiversity loss. But okay, so the y-axis is predicted extinction in percentage terms, and the x-axis is this warming axis. I think it's useful to try to estimate a global pattern, but I would raise a couple of questions about this. Firstly, we can see a lot of scatter around the global estimate. And we can see that the size of these dots, by the way, represents the number of species represented in the sample. So it's weighted. And by weighting it, you're naturally trying to estimate a global curve. But what you do is you exclude or you downplay the enormous risks at fairly low warming levels to some very important biodiversity hotspots. So by saying, well, okay, we've got an accelerating risk of extinction, but it suggests that we can go, even 3-4 degrees, we're still, blipping above 10%. Whereas in fact, in some parts of the world, the predictions are that they would be well above 20% at less than 2 degrees. So I think one's got to be quite careful in how to interpret and understand the analyses of data like these. And another thing that I would point out is that, is this really the shape of this extinction curve? Because if you think about it, each one of these dots represents hundreds, tens to hundreds of species, which are predicted either to go extinct or not to go extinct. So these are just hundreds of Bernoulli trials with a yes or no answer. This really should, I think, be modeled as a logistic regression, which would give you a curve that might, look something like this, as opposed to a smooth curve like this. But what I'm trying to point out is that we have somewhere to go before we really understand global patterns of extinction and how to express them and what to say about them, and even how to model them. Because for the developing world, where many hotspots are found, we don't want to see these risks being muted by an analysis like this, which, as good as it is, and as justifiable as it is, may well create the impression that it's not so urgent. It's urgent in the longer term, but it may be not so urgent in the short term. These circles here indicates very urgent in the short term. So we need to understand this. And I think biodiversity hotspots are just brilliant places in which to do this. Why would you have such high extinction for such low levels of warming? One of the problems is that this x-axis is not a simple temperature axis. It's a compound axis. It includes temperature and drought and other things which are modeled. So it's not a one-dimensional axis, and these hotspots may well be driving a much higher rate of extinction because there's a compound effect. There are also threshold effects because you're going outside of the Pleistocene envelope. So we've got a way to go, and biodiversity hotspots, as I say, are a natural laboratory for helping us understand this. Brian Enquist has done some great work on this, going back to this brilliant paper, The Commonness of Rarity. And what he shows is that the human footprint overlaps much more with biodiversity hotspots than it does with the rest of the globe. It's a much higher rate of human presence in biodiversity hotspots, which adds pressure to these hotspots. But also that the rate of climate change projected in biodiversity hotspots is much higher than the background rate. So if we see here the background rate of climate change represented by the ratio of future to historical velocity of temperature change. This is a rate term. And we look at the areas with rare species and the background rate. We can see the highest background rates really overlap with areas with higher biodiversity. Another reason why we're extremely worried about this. And I'm just about to finish, but one of the biggest papers that came out in the last couple of years was by Miners et al. And they showed, actually I should say we showed because I was a co-author. We showed that endemism really increases climate change risk in areas of high biodiversity importance. And what we see here with different levels of warming is that endemic species, both marine and terrestrial, have the highest sensitivity in terms of extinction risk versus non-endemics and introduced or invasive species. So there are virtually no risks for invasive species. but for and lower risks for endemics, but the for non-endemic natives, but for endemics the risks are the highest. And these are the species that we think are the most vulnerable, that have evolved, as I've explained. The problem is that up to 40% of the world's flora is too rare to even model in the way that was summarized in Urban, for example, 2015. So are we grossly underestimating the biodiversity extinction risk? I would say there's probably quite a strong argument that we are, and we're losing species even without knowing it. All right, so to conclude, where are we? Yeah. You know, we've got complications for projecting biodiversity risks. One of the reasons 40% of terrestrial plant species are very rare, not even modeled. The highest rates of biodiversity loss are predicted in areas of high biodiversity and under climate change. We need well-designed monitoring and linked modeling efforts to be implemented in these areas. They're going to help us with our theoretical basis, and we need a network of sites across multiple regions to really build up this knowledge. And I would really argue for something like that. Thanks very much for listening. I hope I didn't go on for too long.
Thank you so much, Guy. That was really fascinating. Unfortunately, not the best news, but I think lectures like this will help with awareness. And I think what you mentioned at the end about monitoring is so vital, and, you know, understanding what those indicators are. There's a lot we can do as well. Once again, thanks so much. That was really great. And now over to Jen to moderate the live Q&A session.
All right, so we do have some questions coming into the chat, but I do usually like to start, especially as a young person coming into the climate realm. Guy, if you could kind of expand on how your studies in climate have evolved since when you started in the field, and kind of how you got to where you are now.
Oh, lovely. I'll try to be quick. I think we've become much more mechanistic and much more suspicious of the correlative modeling methods. There's a scientist called Steve Higgins in Germany who's starting to model plant species in a much more mechanistic way, using species distributions to fit mechanistic driven species range models. We've also built in things like dispersal and population dynamics, fire, disturbance, and, you know, of course, landscape structure because of the human impact. So much more sophisticated. And I think we also we're looking back in time a lot more to understand the terminal glacial, which is very rich in examples of reasonably rapid climate change. So we published a paper quite recently on the quiver tree and how its current distribution may reflect post-glacial warming. And we're now looking at the genetic structure of that species, which has a massive range from South Africa into Namibia, and to understand this. We've done some work on penguins and their response to the changes in island availability due to sea level change off the coast of Southern Africa. It's never been done before. Very fascinating. But we've got a paper there in submission. So yeah, looking at the past helps to understand the future.
Great.
Thank you for that question.
Okay, so from Giannis, sorry if I'm not pronouncing correctly, asks, is reforestation an adequate mitigation mechanism on loss of forests due to forest fires?
I think reforestation with the right species is vital. You know, there's species you can reforest with the wrong species and accelerate fire. You go and plant eucalyptus into tropical African forests, you're creating a potential fuel bed. So I think the way one does restoration, reforestation, it's got to be done very carefully. Afforestation is a big no-no in our part of the world. Afforestation destroys high diversity systems which are fire driven. And we have a campaign to fight against afforestation. The Trillion Tree Project, we've got many questions about that. They're starting to adapt their maps of where to afforest, but we need to fight back against that.
Thank you. And I know there are a few other authors also on the panel, Leonard Nurse, Joel Smith, and Pam Berry. So feel free to jump in whenever if you would like to, but I'll keep going with the other questions in the chat for now. So from Kirsten Paff, can anything be done to protect these unique species from extinction?
Yeah, that's lovely. We're trying to find ways which aren't too expensive, but one of the ways we have been looking at it, and I had a master's student look at this, and others are looking at this around the world, is assisted translocation or assisted migration for plants which are, and dispersed. Is there a way to anticipate where we can plant them in ways that is not going to be disruptive to the ecosystem? We don't want to create new endemic invasives. It's quite difficult, and conservationists, we move animals around the landscape with gay abandon. Well, not really with gay abandon anymore, we used to. But plants, we don't. And I think one area that we can look at here, which I think is important, is the scenarios in which we get a slight overshoot of global warming. Those sorts of responses, I think, would pay off in an overshoot scenario, because you come back to, within a few decades to a reasonable temperature. So I think mitigation, adaptation interactions in the conservation space is going to be, it's got a big future, and particularly relating to overshoot. There was a recent paper on overshoot and species range shifts recently. I see there's a question about robust systems analysis on, so this would be a question about, effects radiating through the ecosystem. Not a lot available on this, but maybe Jen, you want to answer this question as well. I think it's understudied.
Sure, and I also see Leonard has his hand up. Leonard, did you want to jump in?
Yes, thanks, Jen. Great discussion, Guy. Good to see you. A quick question. How critical do you think is land use change in combination with anthropogenic forcing of climate as a factor in species extinction in biological hotspots? Any thoughts at all? Because I like the way you approach this. You've looked at it in sort of a multi-dimensional way, rather than just using models or just looking back at past data. And I think the way you've brought your presentation together was really unique. And I just think that I've recently been seeing too many assessments of hotspots under the changing climate that really do not adequately take into consideration things like land use changes over time.
Thanks, Leonard. And it's nice to see you. I think we last saw each other at UNFCCC.
Yeah.
In the Nairobi Work Program or something. Yes. Basically, what's really interesting about the fynbos is that it is on land that tends to be less utilized by people. It's in mountains. A lot of the land around the base of those mountain ranges has been converted, but there are very, very extensive swathes of natural vegetation running over hundreds of kilometers where there is essentially no land use. So this is another reason why it's a useful system to look at. Because you somewhat eliminate the direct human impact. Increasingly, we're getting impacts from harvesting for medicinal purposes and things like that, but they're fairly small effects. But I would say in the Mediterranean basin in Europe and North Africa, one couldn't do this without a clear understanding of land use. But you can build those layers into models which would accelerate the dispersal of some species and decelerate the dispersal of others. So we now have ways of starting to build that in mechanistically. But land use, we know, is the biggest current threat to much biodiversity and biodiversity hotspots. It's isolating and fragmenting natural vegetation and making it even more vulnerable to climate change and making us more vulnerable to the exposure to diseases and things. So yeah, we've got to get on top of that kind of thing. It's a very, very useful point. Thank you.
Great. So the next question comes from Ro, and maybe Pam or Joel want to jump in on this one if they would like. But Ro says, glad you pointed out that the argument of climate always changing does not recognize that higher species evolve over hundreds of thousands of years, and extinction can happen in a much shorter period. Thank you. It is an important point that is not mentioned enough. What is the most effective method to focus this message for policymakers and the public?
I think the most effective message is that we live on a cool, adapted planet. Bottom line, we are children of the Pleistocene. We're children of the Ice Age. And just because we live in an interglacial, it doesn't mean that all our fellow species are as comfortable as we are. For some reason, the Holocene has opened up a niche for humans. You've got to ask the question, why humans have been around for a couple of 100,000 years. Why have we only evolved modern civilization in the last 6,000? Stable climate, high CO2, warm conditions, but not too warm. It's a Goldilocks answer. CO2 plays a role, temperature plays a role, climate zones play a role. And we've got to keep in the Goldilocks zone. So, but for our fellow passengers on the planet, they appear to be adapted to cooler conditions. We flourish in the high CO2 warmer conditions, akin to conditions that maybe tropical forests do best in. But that's not true of a huge majority of our fellow species. So we've got to understand that. So we live on a cool, adapted planet, and we better embed that into our consciousness as deeply as we can.
Great. Pam, did you want to jump in?
Yes, I think I will. Just following up on sort of rates of species evolution, it's not something I'm an expert on. And I certainly take Guy's point, but I think there is evidence out there in the literature that some species actually can adapt extremely quickly. And therefore, I'd want to sound a sort of note of caution on that. I'm not saying it's going to be the answer, that species will in fact adapt or evolve faster than we think, but I think we should just recognize that that is a possibility for some species, but I emphasize some.
No, Pam, I totally agree. Nice to see you, by the way. I haven't seen you for ages. I agree fully. Some species will adapt. Look, the Northern Hemisphere is full of species that are pre-adapted to very rapid climate change. Why? Because you got glaciated and nothing survived unless it could disperse under at a very high rate. So all your Northern Hemisphere forests are actually quite, in biodiversity terms, quite boring, because you just very seldom encounter a new species as you wander over hundreds of meters to kilometers. It's the same old oaks, it's the same old beeches, the same old pines. You come to our part of the world, you literally walk as you go step to step, you're encountering new species all the time. And that is a massive contrast. So I would agree. We don't, I think, focus enough on those tough, adaptable, broad range species. Biologists tend to focus on interesting, rare things. But we need to ask the question, well, can we survive in a world in which we've lost 50% of our biodiversity? What does that world look like? How does it work? are we going to be fine? Does it matter that we lose all the long proboscis flies? Who cares? So those kinds of questions, I think, are really, really worth asking. And we don't work enough on understanding large range species and how adaptable they are. But thank you very much for making that point. I totally agree with you. But I would argue for the South, and we can't just chuck all these species away. That is, I think that's, we've got to be careful. Thank you.
Yeah, I would agree. Having visited South Africa, I love your biodiversity compared with our boring northern forests, but keeping them there.
They can be, they're very beautiful en masse, but indeed, yeah, they low beta diversity, let's say. Very equitable though.
Joel, did you want to add anything from your end?
It's good to see you, looking good.
Long time, Joel. I didn't hear that.
We're having trouble with your audio, Joel.
How fast can you type, Joel?
It's not better. Okay, I'll pass. I'll
no,
pass.
I can hear you now.
Now you can hear me. Okay,
Yeah,
good.
yeah.
I'm having some trouble with my laptop, so apologize for that. I wasn't even sure I could join the meeting. No, I was going to say, I think, it's nice to see you, Guy, from this long distance. Wish we were closer. Biodiversity is one of the key reasons for helping to define what's a dangerous level of climate change.
Absolutely.
We want to protect biodiversity. I mean, it is one of the key drivers of the Framework Convention. In a lot of ways, although the other drivers tend to be about human systems, and they're managed systems. And by definition, since they are managed, they're more adaptable. The worry that many of us have about ecosystems, and particularly biodiversity, is, and as you've so well, and by the way, it was a brilliant talk, so I really appreciate it. And it would have been fine for me if you'd gone on longer, but but I thought it was, I mean, it's the lack of adaptability or the heterogeneity, shall we say. And then it's also, it just struck me too, because I have noticed that figure you showed from the 2015 science paper, sort of aggregating biodiversity. And as you say, it tends to almost minimize it. It's funny how prepared to say, oh, it's just, well, a few more things are lost between whatever 1 or 2 degrees. And you realize, but the whole point of that, each of these are unique and valuable systems. Absolutely. That in some respects, philosophically, maybe, you can't even put a value on these ones. They're invaluable in a way. And so the point of this, and this is in U.S. law, by the way, at least maybe until our Supreme Court gets to it, that we have an Endangered Species Act that essentially says that every species is valuable, and it is the policy of the government to try to protect all species, at least in the United States. And so it's this trade-off, and I thought you made that point very well, that even in the small amount of warming, very, I mean, look, coral reefs as an example. They well become of all the marine diversity, and then so many other terrestrial species too. And that is a trade-off that makes it all very difficult, right? Because we know what a struggle it is to try to control emissions. And it just seems that, and I think one point that graph makes, look, everything you do to reduce emissions has some benefit. And
yes.
And whatever you do, it isn't going to be enough, but you need to keep doing more. So that's the sort of philosophic point, but thanks for raising that. And I remember, Pam raised that too in her talk. I mean, this whole question of biodiversity and the difficulty of adaptation. And I think, Leonard's point too, and then the humans, we're not just doing it with the greenhouse gases, we're doing it with multiple insults to the environment. And, it's all coming together. And by the way, it isn't just thousands of years, you look at it, it's really post-World War II. That's when emissions really took off, population, land use. I mean, it's really, with not that long within our lifetimes or our parents' lifetimes, for some of us, grandparents, for others, but it's not that long at all. It's just a dramatic change, and it's overwhelming. So I rambled on about that. My question is, okay, tell me about what you've seen in the Cape region. You've had some warming, you've had, obviously pointed out, extreme drought, long-term trends. Have you been tracking impacts on biodiversity, and what have you seen so far?
Yeah, great. Thanks for those comments, Joel. I could respond at length, but we need to get together, obviously. That is a great question. You know, doing the tracking work is very challenging, and it's expensive, and it takes time. So we have one exceptionally good paper carried out by someone called Jasper Slingsby, who monitored the changes in species richness in the Cape Peninsula National Park. And the reason we could do this was that an older botanist called Hugh Glenn had sampled the park in a very careful way, recorded everything back in the 1950s, I think. And so we were able to go back, Jasper was able to go back to the precise locations where he had had his plots, and was able to analyze the biodiversity, the species composition. And what popped out of that analysis was that there are suites of species that have declined, and they are particularly species that are vulnerable to post-fire droughts. In other words, you have a fire, you have a drought, there are a bunch of species which are reseeding into that environment that start getting excluded. And that, you know, you don't get that kind of an answer by going out for a couple of weeks into the vegetation and sampling. It's a very challenging thing to do. So that's one great study. We've also done a lot of work on this quiver tree, Allodendron dichotomum, which is a desert tree. It's an incredible thing. Who would imagine you find forests in the desert? Sorry, this is my son trying to call me. Anyway, and this tree has a range all the way up into Namibia and down into South Africa. And we, despite a little bit of contention about the analysis, we reckon that we've got strong evidence to show that the range of the species is contracting in the warmer areas, and it's expanding in the cooler areas. So we think we're looking at a dynamic range shift going on in response to warming and climate change. And we think it probably dates all the way back to the Pleistocene. So we think we'll be able to use genetics, at least to test that idea. So those are two ideas. We've also seen deaths in baobab trees that are hundreds of years old. These big baobabs have died off relatively suddenly. Contentious, we don't know. Again, it's the attribution, Joel. It's so difficult to attribute when you have a system that's so interrelated. But I do think that, I believe Chris Tresos's paper on thresholds. I think that these systems are going to hit thresholds, and we're going to see scores of species disappearing at roughly the same time. And I think niche theory would predict that as well. And I would just hope that we stop warming before we get to that level. I would rather be able to say, fortunately, no, we haven't seen that many extinctions yet, because I worry that once we start to really see extinctions, it's going to be, you know, we'll see a lot. But we are seeing a lot of populations dying back. It's apocryphal, and yeah, but great question. It's expensive and difficult to do. And if you think of ways of raising funding to do it, we've got the Natural Laboratory here to do it. And you've seen oaks dying, right? California, in the droughts because they ran out of water. You're seeing a lot of mortality. And then insects in the tropics, there's some unexplained collapses in insect populations. So there are things happening, right? Amphibians, things are happening, but it hasn't been tied together well yet. And it's not been linked to the modeling well. That's also a big opportunity.
Well, thank you so much, Guy, and thank you to the other authors. That was a rich discussion. I wish we could continue, but we are running out of time, unfortunately. There are a few questions in the chat that, Guy, you can feel free to type your answer as we do our wrap-up slides. We missed one on tools and metrics that is interesting, so feel free to type it in, but thank you, everyone, and I'll pass it back to Manishka.
Thanks so much, Jen. Yeah, it was such a great Q&A session that, it was worth going over, and we still have a large portion of our attendees as well. So I'm sure they enjoyed it as well. So thanks so much, Guy, for your wonderful presentation and for answering all those questions. And thank you to Pam, Leonard, Joel for participating. And I'd like to switch to David briefly so that he can say a few words of wrap up, and then I'll share the link to where you can find the recordings and wrap up in a couple of minutes. Over to you, David.
Thanks, Guy, and thanks everybody who participated in the Q&A. The idea that plants and many other species are cool adapted is, as Guy said, something that really people don't pay attention to enough. With that in mind, you might ask the question, since interglacials, as Guy pointed out, often last 10 or 20,000 years, when is the next glacial age going to come to bring the world back into the optimum condition for many plants and species? And nobody really knows that for sure. The initiation of glaciation has been tied very roughly to particular orbital configurations. You, in fact, on one of your slides had a picture of orbital configurations associated with the glacial interglacials. A study was done with respect to nuclear waste deposits, because they have to be secured for 100,000 years. And so people don't want glaciers coming back and forth over them to disrupt them. And an estimate was made that in this particular case, for these particular orbital configurations, the next glacial age will not start for another 50,000 years. So if we're expecting help from the skies, we can't expect it, really. Anyway, thanks, Guy. Thanks for the wonderful talk.
Great pleasure. Lovely talking to you. Such a great bunch. And yeah, hope to see you all in person at some stage.
Manishka,
Thank you. Thank you, David. Thank you, Guy. Thanks, Jen, for moderating that really interesting Q&A session. I've just shared where everyone can access the recordings. Most of them have already been uploaded, and will take about a week to upload this lecture as well. And thank you so much for participating. Spread the word about these webinars and the recordings, because the objective of the book and the webinar series is to really reach as many students, teachers, professionals, and all interested people across the world, especially in regions with limited resources. So we hope that these resources will help advance climate change education across the world. And thank you to the audience for your participation, to the speakers, the panelists, and see you all in 2 weeks. Thanks so much. Have a wonderful day. Bye.
Cheers all. Thanks, Manishka.
Thank you. Bye.